started to tell me a little bit about Muscle Shoals and about the actual... Describe a typical recording session there.
I usually would come down on a Thursday. The artist would come on a Thursday. Let's say it'd be Wilson Pickett. We'd meet at the studio with somebody who was capable of writing the chords down. Before I got there, I had, with the artist, we'd agreed on the material. Either I found the songs for him or her, or they found some songs. Anyhow, the material was already picked. And we had lead sheets with the lyrics and the chord changes, but that's all. So we'd sit down with the arranger. It turned out to be Barry Beckett, arranger in a sense, that, and he would play the chords and we'd pick a key. It's very important, you know, when you do a song, like what key will it be in? And we always look for the optimal key for the singer, and usually it would be the highest key in which he would be comfortable. Not always. Sometimes it would turn out that that was not the best key for the horns, but mostly we'd want to push him up there. So we'd work out the layout of the song and the key, and then Barry or somebody would write the chords down, and they'd Xerox them, and on Monday at 1 o'clock, the session would start. We'd come into the studio, and everybody had the charts on his music stand. These were charts only in a sense with just the chords, as I described the Memphis thing. And we start to play these chords until somebody would come up with a pattern, because the chords themselves do not a rhythm base make. You need the in-betweens to form a rhythm pattern, and that becomes the basis. That's the cake, and everything else is the icing. And we'd keep playing into this until we had a good rhythm pattern. Didn't have the singer sing, but I always wanted the singer to be there. A lot of records are made without the singer, traditionally. Whether it could range anything, you know, from Frank Sinatra with a Nelson Riddle arrangement, you know, to a Percy Faith or whatever, or Tony Bennett. Here's the key. See you in the studio, Tony. There'd be the whole arrangement. Traditional way of recording. I always wanted the singer to be there, because at some point in the development of the rhythm pattern, I wanted the singer to contribute, to be there, so that the rhythm section would hear her, how she phrased, where she came to the end of a line, where she picked up into the next one on the, you know, on the new 8 bars or whatever. And also, if it happened to be a person who played, well or poorly, I wanted them to play on that record, because a singer who could play, a little or a lot, would put something of her own or his own into it that you couldn't get otherwise, by playing and by singing, not necessarily doing the two at the same time. It was most important to have them singing a working vocal before the track was really finished, because there needed to be interaction. A great drummer like Roger Hawkins always wanted to know the lyrics of the song. He'd have the lyrics there, because he would not only play the music, he would play the lyrics.
Now with Dusty, obviously, later on, you didn't have the...
That was another kind of problem. But let me finish with this. At some point, when the track was ready, we'd go for real, with a real vocal and a real rhythm track. And it would be desirable to get it pretty quick before everybody was worn out, because there'd been enough playing. When things went well, we would do 4 tracks in one day with vocals, so that it was not unusual for us to do an album in a week. We'd have lead vocal, sometimes background vocals. And then maybe in the next week, we would do some sweetening. One of the more interesting experiences, and I believe I learned something about recording on every session I ever did. Something would occur that would teach me something about how to do the next one. And if I ever acquired a minimal competence at producing a record, it really happened when I went south. That's how I feel. Although I'm credited with a lot of pretty good records from the 50s into the early 60s with some pretty good singers. But I feel I really learned the inside of how this gets together, what the components were. And one of the more interesting sessions was with Bob Dylan. Because when Dylan, gave me the great honor of saying, I want you to produce my next record. And I said, thank you, Bob. Just tell me, sir, where do I stand and when do we begin? And I had no idea that we were going to do a gospel session, nor did I care. It's Bob Dylan. You want to do the Yellow Pages? Yes, sir, boss. Whatever. And so I told him that I wanted to take him to Muscle Shoals, but I wanted to change the rhythm section somewhat. And I wanted Mark Knopfler to play lead guitar and Pick Withers as drummer to play the drums, because I didn't want a standard Muscle Shoals imprint on it. I had a notion called the aesthetic rub, which into a given situation of known factors, you introduce a new and novel situation with unknown factors and see what comes out of that. So Bob, who you always think is so fantastic with these peripheral remarks and these ironic asides and so on, like John Lennon, with all these great épaté le bourgeois remarks. He knows everything that's going on, because when I said to him, I wanted to bring Mark Knopfler in, he says, good idea. He does me better than anybody. So we went down there, and I said to Mark, no, don't play like Mark Knopfler, play like Albert King, because I didn't want the Dire Straits guitar sound, which, by the way, he got from his sound was from a great country artist who wrote After Midnight.
J.J. Cale.
J.J. Cale. If you listen, if you know, J.J. Cale is much more appreciated in Europe than he is over here. He's one of the greatest we ever had. To me, Mark Knopfler's very distinctive guitar sound is a J.J. Cale sort of clone. But I wanted to get away from that. Anyhow, that was one of all the sides. So I didn't have an idea in the world of how it was going to work with Dylan. So the first day, we start recording, and Bob starts singing and playing on every take of every track, and we wind up with a total disaster. We were staying in a house that we leased that was provided for us by Jimmy Johnson for that purpose. And we go back to play what we'd done during the day, and I think it was one song, and it was like a funeral parlor. It was terrible. Now I'm in big trouble. Here I have my shot with Bob Dylan, with the master. So the next day, I persuade Bob not to sing until the track has reached a certain stage of development. But Bob didn't like the idea of isolation, of the amps being separated, and then the musician being separated, and the drums with the gobos, everything isolated. We couldn't get a groove going. So I got this idea. It's okay. Let's all guys get together in the middle of the floor and start playing the music. You can all hear each other. Leakage for days. Cool. But I had the engineer run a quarter track monotape while they're doing this, and they play and they hit a fearsome groove. I mean, you could just walk on it. So, okay, it's time now everybody get back to your cubby holes, put on the phones. And I played this track back to them, the groove that they'd just been playing, and had them play along with it. Now they're playing along with this thing. Of course, it's leaking into everything. But they get a groove now. Stop that feed of that quarter-inch tape, and Barry counts off. We made 4 fantastic tracks that day, and we knocked the whole thing off. And it was something new. I mean, there's nothing in the books like that or about that. It was just a way of solving a problem with a great idiosyncratic artist who was willing to go along with the gag.
Relationships with artists, and Dylan is as great an artist as there is. I mean, you have, there is a certain psychologist and lots of different aspects to being a producer.
Well, I would venture to say that we're very fond of each other to this day. I have always, gotten that signal.
Just with artists in general, you obviously have a certain philosophy about your approach to working with an artist.
Well, I don't have any. In fact, I don't have a sound and I don't have a style. I just be myself, whatever it is, and try to be honest, and try to be real, and not to manipulate, or to maneuver, but to make them comfortable, so that the best comes out of them. Whether it's comfort, it's whether way you get the hamburgers. Whether you go to the Dairy Queen or the Pool Room in Muscle Shoals, which had the best hamburgers, or whether it's how they hear me speaking to the musicians, or whatever it is, or how much feed I give them in the phones, or what kind of feed. I mean, the whole thing has to do with comfort and truth. It's like truth in advertising, truth in recording, not trickery or manipulation. Well, this story's been told a million times that Otis Redding was driving for a band called Johnny Jenkins. I think it was also the bass player. And I had a representative working for me in the South doing promotion and scouting named Joe Galkin, a wonderful guy left over from the song plug era. And he called me one day and said, I can do an album with this band called Johnny Jenkins for $2,000. That's what the kind of thing you could do in those days. So I said, go ahead. So he went up to Stax with the Johnny Jenkins band, and Otis Redding was the driver. At the end of the session, Otis Redding speaks to, whether it was to Steve or Al Jackson, and how he talked them and Jim Stewart into letting him sing a song. And of course, everybody was knocked out. So he did a couple of sides. Now, officially and technically, those sides belong to Atlantic Records, not Stax, because Stax, in effect, was providing a custom studio and band for us. But there was no discussion. They just put it out on Stax. And I said, well, let it be like that, because I'm not going to, get technical or stand on my rights. So that's how Otis came out, Stax, and we got to know each other. The first time he came to New York to play the Apollo Theater, no retinue, nobody. I went to LaGuardia and picked him up, and I took him and installed him in a Teresa Hotel, and we became very good friends. Otis was being managed by a young Southerner from Macon, Georgia. That's a tautology. Of course, he's a Southerner if he's from Macon, named Phil Walden. And Phil Walden had brought Otis along as his manager and so on. And we became friendly. There was just a natural, affinity we had for each other. And at that time, I was living part of the year in Miami, and I had this boat called the Big A, a 46-foot sports fisherman. I say I had by courtesy. No, it belonged to Warner Communication. I had the use of it because it still was the honeymoon period of the merger with Warner and Seven Arts, and the bloom was still on the rose. Everything was fresh, so we kept making more and more demands and said, "I'd like to have this boat." Okay, you got it. Full-time captain, you got it. Until they wised up and realized that we were dispensable in effect. And so I was on this boat with Phil Walden, and we had a captain. We used to fish for billfish, for sailfish and white and blue marlin. It was great. It was great. Lived the water life. And everybody came down. Peter Grant came down, and Jimmy Page. They fished off that boat. And Dusty was there. It was a big item at that particular period. It was late 60s, I guess, And Phil says to me, "I'd like to start a studio in Macon, and could you help us finance it?" I said, "Let's do better than that. Start a label and bring in talent." And we called it Capricorn as a gag because we're both Capricorns, although we don't believe in that nonsense, We had to call it something. It's like they had to call it something, so they called it Hadacor, that whole thing. So we called it Capricorn. And Phil says, we're going to put the Allman Brothers together. Now, at that time, Dwayne was under contract to Rick Hall and Muscle Shoals as a sideman. So I bought his contract. I bought him out. I gave Rick Hall $15,000 to free him up to start. Well, Rick thought the heavens had opened because $15,000 for a guitarist who doesn't write songs and can't sing, you got it, baby, So that was the beginning of the Allman Brothers. Around this time, Dusty came into the picture because we're thinking of Led Zeppelin, whom I had signed originally. One of the inspirations to sign the Led Zeppelin, who had not recorded a note of music, it was just a fallout from the Yardbirds, more or less, without Eric Clapton. And Dusty was being managed by a man named Harold Davison, and his representative, his lawyer in New York, happened to be a neighbor of mine named Steve Weiss. So Steve Weiss said Dusty would like to sign with you, and she would like you to produce the records, me. And so we signed her up, and we had a key man clause, meaning that if for any reason I were to leave the company or out of the picture, that she'd be out of the contract. For whatever reason, that's how much she wanted me to be a producer. So you would think that would be, very helpful. Well, as it turned out, Dusty came to the States to prepare for the session, and I was living in Great Neck, Long Island then, and she came out to the house, and I had tons of tunes prepared already. I don't know how many. I mean, this was before cassettes, so we had acetates all over the floor, on the chairs, the tables. I don't know how many songs I played her, 40, 50, 60. She didn't like any of them. So it was, Wexler 60, Dusty 0. And she went back to Blighty. Now what do we do? Well, I had a band ready, and I was going to take her to Muscle Shoals, and they were ready. That was, of course, canceled. She came back, and a few weeks or a few months later, I don't remember, and out of that bunch of songs, that same songs, I picked 15. I played those 15 songs, and she couldn't have been more entranced. Oh, what great material. So we narrowed it down to 10 or 11, and instead of taking her to Muscle Shoals, it didn't work out time-wise, I took her to Memphis, to a studio called the American Studio, under Chips Moman. And that was a great band because they also backed up King Curtis, they backed up Elvis, it included great players like Reggie Young, Tommy Cogbill. And later, that band, well, no, that's another story. So we went down there to make the record, and as I mentioned before, we start with the rhythm section. At some point, we bring in the singer. Dusty refused to sing. We got the keys, and we made these tracks. She just wouldn't sing, not a note. And it turns out that these were her insecurities, and she was a very complex person. I really loved her dearly, and I just loved her sound, because there never was a sound like Dusty Springfield. I don't think there ever will be. I mean, especially from a white Brit. I mean, to have this beautiful, incredible soul come out. And I never heard her sing with better intonation. She never missed a note. So we wind up in New York with the tracks, and we put a voice on, we put our vocals on these tracks. And we're feeding the track into our headphones. She keeps saying, louder please, more please, more please, more. And it had been my custom, I had learned this, that you feed the singer the minimum, that he can just barely hear it, because the more you feed them, the softer they get, the less they project. The less you feed them, the more they push and push that vocal out there. But she was the exception. She kept saying, give me some more, I can still hear myself. What? Finally, we had it to a level, I took just one phone, I put it to my ear, and I recoiled. I mean, it was like pain. She sang, she put these vocals down, and she couldn't hear herself. Now, how the hell she did it, I don't know. But it turns out to be Dusty in Memphis, Son of a Preacher Man, which was written for Aretha Franklin, by the way. And Aretha was not in the mood to do it at that time. Just as Let It Be was written for Aretha Franklin. And Paul or John sent me an acetate the year before it came out. And first of all, I couldn't get Aretha to do it. When she finally did it, she didn't want it out. Next thing you know, I get a legal stop order from the Beatles management not to put it out, because the Beatles were coming out with their own record. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard Aretha's version of Let It Be, but it is cosmic. So we missed the boat one more time.
It eventually came out, yeah?
Yeah, in an album. Oh, and only in an album, of course. Same thing with Son of a Preacher Man. But let me tell you that at this time, we finally got it done with Dusty. And at this time, she heard about Led Zeppelin. She said, you got to sign them. I know Bonzo and Jimmy. She said, they're the best. They're going to be great. And that had a lot to do with my thinking. I don't say that I signed them because Dusty said so, but it sure played into my assessment at the time. And so I wound up signing them, and, you know, it was like one of the good additions, one of the great additions.
Let me ask you about that, because that's really sort of the final chapter of your period of Atlantic. And I mean, it was the period where the British Blues Revival, and there was Stigwood bringing over Cream. And I want to know how Cream, because I see Stigwood has a production credit on Fresh Cream, and I didn't know he was an actual record producer.
Well, of course he isn't and wasn't. I mean, just an honorific. But Bob, love him, being the character that he always is and was, and I hope he's well and happy. And of course, he also brought us the Gibbs brothers, you know. And he and Epstein came over together with the acetates and brought them to Ahmed. And Ahmed flipped out immediately. Ahmed was the point man on that one. And then, of course, when I heard the records, I said, boy, you know, can't miss. And then I remember that we were sitting around, and Ahmed and Stigwood, I happened to walk into the office, and they're saying, now, who are we going to get to produce the Bee Gees? And they were talking about all the big names, Phil Ramone, George Martin, or whatever. And I must say, I said, wait a minute, you got somebody sitting right here in this office. You don't have to go out and hire some new talent. Arif Mardin. And Arif put it all together with the Saturday Night Live stuff and all of that. And Albie Galutin was a kid hanging out at the studio, and we just let him hang out for nothing. And at that time, I was living in Miami, and I had this rhythm section called the Dixie Flyers, which later turned out to be Chris Christopherson's band. And once I started recording at Criteria, a lot of people came down and followed, and including the Bee Gees and Stephen Stills, and then eventually, of course, Eric Clapton with Layla, Delaney and Bonnie. And Albie Galutin and Carl Richardson. Carl was a kid engineer, and Albie Galutin was a kid musician hanging out. And Tom Dowd came to him one day and said, "Put the kid on the payroll. Let's give him $50 a week so he can eat." Well, that transition went from $50 a week to millionaires. That's Bee Gees producers.
Yourself, I mean, the Bee Gees and even Cream. I mean, Cream were blues-based.
Oh, yeah, Cream was fantastic.
But I mean, it's a quantum leap from the music that you had been used to then.
Yeah, but I saw that. I mean, I appreciate that value, and I appreciated Crosby, Stills and Nash, and Buffalo Springfield, and Sonny and Cher, and I'm not so sure that I was attuned to every one of our British bands. I'm not going to mention the ones that I wasn't attuned to, but we had some pretty big records with some of those people.
But Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton, I assume,
I knew.
must have looked up to you as, having produced all the stuff they grew up on.
Well, you'd have to ask them about that. I have no idea.
I just wondered if you had a personal relationship. I mean, I know you didn't end up producing them per se.
No. Well, I've always been friendly with Eric and with Jimmy, because Bert Burns actually brought Jimmy Page to the States back in the 60s, and because Bert had been to England and he thought that he would be using him as a session man here, but it didn't work out. There were union problems and so on. He was known as Little Jimmy Page at that time.
Didn't he play guitar on the Here Comes the Night?
With Van? No, there was another. What was the other group? Gloria.
Well, Them. Obviously.
Them. Yeah, possibly he was part of them, but I hardly think so, because of union restriction. But I could be wrong.
Anyhow, and Stephen Stills, of course, was multi-talented as in terms of folky, acoustic, and then a rock and roller too.
Of course. And,
now, did you work production? Did you produce any of Stephen's?
No.
Okay. So. Into the 70s, Atlantic was now not only R&B and jazz, but was also and pop, but it was also a bona fide rock and roll.
Very strong.
Where did this leave you? I just want to get to the evolution that led to your leaving in '75.
Well, it had nothing to do with the makeup of the roster or the particular combinations of styles, and it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with, we had sold the company in '67, and by '75, I became a little disenchanted with the corporate setup. And I said, "Tom, I don't think I can be happy here anymore." And of course he was, really desolated. He really didn't want me to go. But there were things that it's not necessary to go into that happened in the hierarchy that did not redound to my comfort or welfare.
That stuff, whatever it is, trickled down to the studio. I mean, normally a producer can block himself away from all that.
No, it didn't trickle to the studio. No, not at all. It just that, after all, I had been a senior vice president and co-chairman of the company. And no, it had to do with my position in the company. And so I left in '75, but I continued to work, especially in Muscle Shoals, with freelancing with people like Dire Straits. I produced Communicate along with Barry Beckett, Sanford and Townsend, Smoke from a Distant Fire, Alan Toussaint, Dr. John.
about Dr. John for a second, because he was a great man, and just tell me about your relationship with him, because he was such a wonderful session man and great songwriter.
Well, there were two particular albums that I did, and they're not big hit famous albums, but to me they're the most enjoyable, and to me they stand up, and somehow I feel these albums. One is Gumbo with Dr. John, which is a synthesis of all the various New Orleans rhythm and blues styles, and the other is an album with Joe Turner called Boss of the Blues. Joe Turner plays Kansas City jazz, which had nothing to do with R&B. It was a pure Kansas City shuffle record with jazz players, including the legendary Pete Johnson, who played on Joe Turner's early boogie woogie records under John Hammond and so on. So those two records. And Dr. John taught me a great deal about New Orleans music, about the history. He's an historian, he's an ethnologist. He and Earl King, who wrote Trick Bag, these two men should be enshrined, and the Smithsonian should take down their words, just the way Alan Lomax took down Zelly Roll Morton's. I really mean that, because it's a very precious heritage, and New Orleans has not gotten its due, has not gotten its credit for its importance in the recording scale.
Speaking of New Orleans, did you not produce an album by Professor Longhair at one point?
Oh, yeah. Well, we produced sides by Professor Longhair. You didn't do albums in those days. Co-produced with Ahmed, especially Tipitina, which was his signature song, and which every New Orleans piano player had to do. So, Dr. John was a student of Professor Longhair, and there were, I think, 5. James Booker, Dr. John, Alan Toussaint, Aaron Neville, and Huey Smith. And like I say, Marcia Ball today plays a pretty damn good Professor Longhair. It's very hard to play.
You wouldn't add Roosevelt Sykes to that list?
No, not as a. He was more of a straight blues player than Professor Longhair. I signed Willie somewhere in the early '70s. I was still at Atlantic, and I had started a country and western branch in Nashville, and staffed it. And I went down there to see the operation and speak to people. And it was run, by the way, by Rick Sanjak. I mean, I picked him to run it. He was Russ Sanjak's son. And there was, or it still is, a great songwriter named Harlan Howard, a great country songwriter. I used to give a party every year, and all the pickers would come, and everybody would be there. Waylon Jennings, Conway Twitty, you name it. What's the name? George Jones. Everybody would be there. And there's Willie Nelson. And they all would play something out of their repertory. And Willie Nelson was out of a record contract. He had the earring, and he had a long pigtail, and the Nashville frowned on this at the time. The morals police were after him, and which it was just wonderful. So I had been a big fan of Willie's, outrageous fan of Willie's. And I was the only one in Atlantic that had any interest in country music, by the way. And so I was introduced to Willie, and I said, man, I've been waiting for a long time, to shake your hand. The next thing you know, I signed him up. And we did Shotgun Willie. I did a little of that. Arif Mardin did most of it. But then we did Phases and Stages, and I did that by myself. And I took Willie to Muscle Shoals to do that record, and everybody in Nashville said, oh, that's a no-no. That's too funky, that's too R&B, that's too black for Willie. But we did Phases and Stages, and a lot of people still think that's one of his best albums.
Very, very last question, and I just want to ask you about any comments that you have on, just over your whole career and with artists that you've seen, comments on prejudice, racism in the industry? I know you work with a lot of blues and R&B artists, and obviously back in the 50s it was so much more prevalent.
Well,
anything in particular?
when I took Wilson Pickett to Muscle Shoals, I think that segregation was over, but he wouldn't go out to a restaurant to eat, so I ate a lot of greasy fried chicken in the hotel room with Wilson at that time. But in general, you know, we faced what you would call a prejudice of not getting our records played on white radio stations. But it's a mistake to attribute this to racism, because people who own record companies are like all other entrepreneurs. All they want to do is sell their product. And the advertisers didn't think that this R&B music would draw the consumers that they were aiming at. It's as simple as that. It didn't have to do with black or white, it had to do with green. And when the crossover happened, that was the end, and the green prevailed.
So, I mean, that was, even during that period, it didn't affect, I mean, I just feel like some of those artists, it couldn't help but affect the way they created, the way they expressed themselves.
Well, here's the thing. In those days, when those artists toured, and they toured the South a lot because that was their venue, that's where they made their money, they faced terrible conditions. They couldn't use a restroom. They couldn't go into a restaurant very often. It was difficult for them to get a place to stop and eat and to stay over. Solomon Burke, this is a nice little, what I call Crow Jim, reverse racism, had a manager at one time called Babe Shivian, and he used to travel the South with Solomon, and he would stay at the black motels that Solomon would check into. And this one place, Babe Shivian comes in, and the woman in charge, the manager, said, "You can't come in here. I just can't allow that. I'd get in trouble." He went back to the truck and put on a do-rag and came back in, and she's, "Okay, you're right now, come on in." But here's the thing. What the artists, the singers, suffered on the road on those tours, there'd be many of them, you know, would travel in one bus, it didn't come into the studio. The studios were integrated for real long before it became official. There was no problem about black and white people playing together. Look at Booker T and the MGs, you know, half black and half white. Muscle Shoals guys, they didn't have an ounce of prejudice. And in all the years there, I never heard the N-word once from those people. And I just like to mention their names because they're very important in my life. They were. It's Jimmy Johnson, who was a studio manager and rhythm guitarist, David Hood, the bassist, Roger Hawkins, the drummer, and Barry Beckett, a great keyboard man, and my man out in the studio. He's in Nashville now these days and doing okay.
You know, it's been a brilliant career and we've gone through about that much of it.
Yeah.
But I appreciate it very, very much. Thank you very much, Jerry.